Hi, good morning and welcome to today's Corporate Governance and Audit Committee. We are on public webcast, so welcome to anyone who's watching either live or later. Hopefully you'll find this interesting. We've got a quite in-depth technical agenda today, so I think we'll crack on if that's okay with members. If you want to speak, remember to use your online protocol, so put your hand up and I'll try and spot you. Keep your microphones off unless you're speaking, and hopefully we'll get through in a normal fashion. Okay, so let's move on to agenda item 1. John.
Agenda item 1, Chair. There are no appeals against the refusal of inspection of documents. Under agenda item 2, there are no items which require the exclusion of the press or public. Under item 3, I'm not aware of any late items of business. Under item 4, could I ask members to declare any disclosable pecuniary interest?
I'll take silence as nothing to declare.
I see no interests. Agenda item 5, apologies for absence. I've got no apologies for absence. I can see everybody's here apart from Councillor Taylor, unless Councillor Taylor speaks up. So we're just waiting for Councillor Taylor. He has accepted the invitation, so as far as I'm aware, he should be joining us. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, John. Okay, minutes of the previous meeting. Let's start with points of accuracy. Has anyone got any points of accuracy to raise? Councillor John Illingworth.
So I was actually about the previous item, but I can speak to two things at once, Chair. One is, do we need to declare land and so forth owned by the rented with it from the council within the Leeds area? I've declared it on my standard declarations, but do we need to mention it today or not? No, by looks of things. Okay.
I don't think so. If you've declared it on your main
declaration. Yeah, that was right. I was just
John or Kate. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah. And I have a point on the next on the minutes, but I'll wait a bit to deal with that.
Kate, did you want to say something on the disclosable interest?
I can't think that there's any decision to be made on the agenda that would directly impact on any interest that you may have. So provided everything's on your register and up to date, that's all great.
Great, thank you. Okay, back to item 6. I'll start with you, John.
Well, it was well, it's not. You haven't done accuracy yet. I was thinking.
Yeah. Matters arising. Okay, moving on. Has anyone got any matters of accuracy? No. So, Kate, can you start with matters arising, and then if Councillor Illingworth wants to say something after that, I'll let him.
Certainly. So, minute 35, the planning report at page 9 of your packs. There has been an exchange of correspondence between Councillor Scopes as chair and the chief planning officers. As a result of this, we anticipate that there will be a draft enforcement protocol produced by the end of this calendar year, and that work is underway to review the public speaking protocol alongside the rest of the service reviews going along in the planning team. And internal audit are undertaking a review of those planning cases which were identified by the committee. Item 36, the employment report at page 10 of the packs. The pulse surveys that members requested further detail on, it was identified that actually the Scrutiny Board Strategy and Resources were receiving a paper in that regard, and an email was circulated to members to point them in the direction of that meeting on the 16th of November. In respect of gifts and hospitality, I've had it confirmed today that there are now only 2 outstanding members of staff who haven't completed the register or made their declaration, and that's because they're absent at the moment, one on sick leave and one on maternity. So those will be picked up as soon as they come back. Item 37, the report in relation to access. The Cabinet Office email was circulated on the 28th of September, and there will be a further update on the access report to come to December's meeting. Item 38, the internal audit update. The reactive anti-fraud information was circulated on the 7th of October as members requested. So that's all I've got on terms of matters arising, Chair.
Thank you very much, Kate. Councillor Illingworth, do you want to come in?
Yes. Oops. Yes. I'm switched on. Yeah, yes, Chair. It's just on the item 35, which is a matter that exercises me greatly. Just inquiring what the procedure will be. Should I be putting together examples of things which I think have not worked very well, or do I wait to be interviewed by audit, or what is the actual protocol for?
So there's three bits here. So in terms of the internal audit review, or in terms of the protocol to ensure stuff is enforced internally?
Well, there's really three limbs to this, aren't there? The internal enforcement, there's the question of the speaking protocol, and there's also the issue that I was concerned about, that there are long-standing strategic issues in Kirkstone which are well known to everybody involved, which are not being brought out in planning cases, and that was obviously causing me great worry and concern. Yeah.
So in terms of the Kirkstone examples, I'm sure that Louise, as head of audit, will contact you during her review of those cases, which will form part of a wider systems review. So whilst those are specific examples, obviously as a committee we want to look citywide to make sure that there isn't any systematic issue, and if there is, what we should do. And I'm sure Louise will talk to you offline on that. In terms of the internal protocol to enforce planning breaches which are on Leeds City Council land, I think we need to see what is recommended and think through those very carefully when they come. Mm-hmm. I can see Louise wants to come in, so I'll bring her in as well, if that's okay.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, just to give you all a bit of an update as to where we are with our review. We've actually gathered most of the evidence, and we are now to a point where we are going to be contacting officers to ensure accuracy of that information. So once we've completed that exercise, we'll be in contact with you, Councillor Illingworth.
Oh, thank you. I just didn't want to miss the boat.
No, not at all. Obviously, there has to be a period of time where we collect the evidence and assess it ourselves. We've gone through that process. We are now in the process of contacting the council planning officers to verify our interpretation, and then we'll be coming back to you.
Okay, lovely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are you satisfied, Councillor Illingworth?
Indeed, yes. I was just concerned to do the job properly.
Yeah. No, good. We've got to keep on it. It's clearly something the committee's spent some time thinking about. I can't see any other hands. I think Louise has put her hand up again, but I think that's probably not intentional. That's good. Okay, so with that, we'll move on to agenda item 8, which is internal audit. I think that's back to you, Louise. You're on mute.
I don't know. Sorry about that. It had to happen at some point.
Yeah, to all of us.
So this is the internal audit annual report and opinion. Previously, I've brought the update report, so this is my first one for Leeds for you today. So today's report is multifunctional in the fact that it actually allows this committee to review the adequacy of the council's internal control arrangements and to consider the annual internal audit report. It satisfied the SIAS requirements for me as head of audit to deliver an annual audit opinion that can be used to inform the council's governance statement, which you'll see later on. And it summarises the work undertaken and completed by internal audit relating to the year 1920. So I'm very pleased that the first part of the report focuses on the annual audit opinion, and yet again it remains satisfactory, which is fantastic. It shows how strong the council's control environment is, and as head of internal audit, it's a big tick from me. A large chunk of the report, so it's around pages 20 to 32, actually gives a lot of detail. It details the totality of the work completed the outcomes and when it was reported to the committee. So because we've discussed this in previous audit committees, I'm not actually proposing to give that in any detail in today's report. So the remainder of the report actually demonstrates how internal audit continue to conform to the public sector internal audit standards. So now, as you know, I'm very new to the team, and it pleases me greatly that there are embedded quality processes and procedures within the function, and this is very much regarded as business as usual. So basically, I don't think it's any exaggeration that I can say that at any point in time we're actually inspection ready. It's that embedded. In fact, only last month we had a remote external quality assessment to ensure we retain our ISO 9001 certificate. Needless to say, we passed with flying colours with only one possible learning opportunity suggested to us. So there were no non-conformances identified. The latter part of the report covers all the feedback we have received in the period. Members will have previously seen the CSQ feedback within the update reports, but in this report we've actually got feedback from CLT. And it pleases me greatly that all CLT value internal audit and fully support the work we do. So before I finish, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank members for their continued support and constructive challenge through this committee. And hearing the Chair's annual report to full council recently clearly demonstrates this. And lastly, I'd like to thank the audit team. They've showed a complete professionalism and dedication through what has been particularly a difficult time. Not only have they had to settle into having a new head of service, they've had to navigate their way through a whole new way of remote working, and I applaud each and every one of them. So thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Louise. Does anyone have questions on this report? Councillor Trustwell, and then I'll bring in Councillor Hammond. Yep.
Yes, thanks, Chair. I think I'm unmuted. Just 4 quick questions. Paragraph 3.5.7 on page whatever it is, it relates to waivers. Could Louise give us some insight into where waivers have been applied? Because I think it's always difficult as members to get our heads around actually what is legit. Well, sorry, I'll not use the word legitimate. What is acceptable and what isn't? In terms of 3.5.18, I think it is. It relates to the government grants that have arisen as a result of COVID. And are there any concerns at the moment about, let me call them, inappropriate applications or even fraudulent ones, and how are we picking up and legislating for that? 3.5.30, there's reference to 3 right to buy applications being stopped, and I wonder if we could get any insight into that. And also in table 1, there are about 5 aspects where the control environment was regarded as limited, and I think in the past we've always had a sort of exception report where the report from audit has indicated what the issues were with each of those, and I think there's only one of those 5 actually referred to in the narrative. Thank you, Chair.
Louise?
Okay, I'll take those in order. The first one about the waivers. Well, fortunately, I do have our procurement specialist on the call as well. Jonathan, do you want to come in and discuss those? Is that okay?
Yeah, of course, yeah. So yeah, this was the second time that we'd looked at the waiver process. So we'd followed this one up following a previous report where we'd given a limited opinion in one of the objectives. In answer to your question specifically, Councillor Trustwell, I mean, waivers can come in for a multitude of reasons, really. I think the important point to note here is that I think one of the particular concerns that we've had in the past is that waivers were being used in circumstances where simply enough time hadn't been allowed for in the procurement process to go through that competitive exercise. So one thing we've been able to look back on here, particularly in light of that, is to see that that is kept to a real minimum, really, in terms of the justification for there being a waiver that's actually in place. So aside from that, it can be several reasons around there simply not really being the required competition in that marketplace. But certainly in the sample that we looked at within the audit, it was a satisfactory justification that's clearly kind of laid out in that decision that's published, if that helps. If you'd like a breakdown, send in of some of the themes, I can certainly look back through that audit and share that with you outside of the meeting without a problem at all.
Yeah, I'd be quite happy with that, Jonathan. I'm pleased that we apply a much more rigid attitude to waivers than our friends in central government.
Louise?
Thank you very much for that, Jonathan. The second point was around the central government grants. We are currently going through a post-payment assurance process, so that's on the business grants. We're also contributing to the current self-isolation payment process, and we're looking at doing some assurance work around that. We've also been contributing to the discretionary business grants, so we're actually very active in a lot of areas. Obviously, there's been a lot of grants paid, and we're doing it on a risk basis. We're actually using the data analytics expert we've got to help identify those higher risk areas, and obviously doing a lot of the matching exercises behind the scenes. So basically, it's still an ongoing process. We're not at the end of the road yet, and it seems like we're going to get more grants, so which is good. But equally, we need to make sure that they're paid out in a controlled and equitable way. So it is still very much a work in progress, Councillor. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. I mean, are we picking up any evidence of fraud?
It's difficult to identify whether it's fraud or whether it's mistake. There's certainly mistakes, and some of it is dare I say, there's been some confusion with some of the guidance and criterion. It's how it's interpreted by the general public when they apply. Fraud is a strong word on occasion. It's they may have been mistaken that they thought they were eligible at times.
Okay.
But we are trying to wheedle those out and actually understand each circumstance individually where we think something untoward might have happened.
Okay. 3.5.30, Louise.
The right to buy. I don't actually have the details on the individual right to buys, but I can find some specific details. It depends on the circumstances of the application. Sometimes, from my previous experience in other councils, it can be because they don't actually have eligibility to live there. It can be that they've actually not lived there long enough, for example. So it can be for multiple reasons, but I can find out the details on those specific cases. And the last point was, could you run through the
limited?
Point,
so it's on the table 1. So there's 5 limited assurances.
Okay.
And they're not all spelled out in this report.
Yeah, my point, Chair, is that in the past, I think we've always had some narrative to explain why they were limited. And I think there's only one of the 5 that's actually referred to in your narrative, Louise. Yeah.
Oh, I see. So it's actually the fact that it's not being pulled through in the themes. I think the rationale behind that this year was the fact that we'd already previously reported them in an update report. So members of the committee had actually seen it previously, but I'm more than happy to pass a separate note, pulling it together in a summary if that's what Councillor Trustwell would like.
Yes, thanks, Chair. I think that would be useful because obviously we deal with a huge amount of complex information, and I don't mind accepting that I don't always retain an historical memory of all of it. And I think officers ought to work on the basis that they tell us again, and then they keep on telling us, and then it might register.
That's fine. As long as you're okay with that, Councillor Trustwell, I'll keep doing that. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Good. Okay. Thanks, Councillor Trustwell. I'll bring in Councillor Harrand.
Thank you. Supplementary to Councillor Trustwell's point, can we all have a copy of that reply, please, at the limited assurance comments? Also supplementary, I too have been impressed by the remarkable procurement arrangements in central government. We couldn't get away with that, could we? 3.5.7 again on procurement and waivers. I think I've asked before, can we have a proportion of procurement that's by value, not just by number? If these are for comparative season, I'm sure I have asked for this before. If I've been given it, I've lost it. But can somebody tell us what proportion of procurement purchases that we make use waiver arrangements? Absolutely,
Councillor Harrand.
Is that yes, we're going to get it now, or yes, we're going to get it later?
Yes, you can. We'll send the information round. Sorry, Councillor Harrand.
And that will be to everybody again, I hope.
It will be.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Harrand. And Councillor Illingworth.
There we go. Yes, Chair. 2 points, two separate points. One is to reinforce the comments made about right to buy. It's an area where members quite frequently are accosted by members of the public with random accusations. I'm sure everybody who's been a councillor has experienced this, and a lot of them are complete rubbish. However, they're not all rubbish, and I've been left with a number of cases where there's some suspicion about whether the person is actually submitted correct information on their housing application form. This is the common story of somebody who's set themselves up to take a tenancy with the express intention, well, secret intention of submitting a right to buy application. They lie about their circumstances, they jump to the top of the queue, and nobody checks up properly on what's going on. And I'm sure every member's encountered complaints of this nature, and I certainly have, and it worries me that we don't respond to them. Second, completely different point is about data analytics. And one thing which I've been very keen to see over the years is greater use of GIS in analysing our expenditure. And I was going to ask you about this, if there are any plans to expand geographic information systems to see where the money is being spent, to look for patterns of spending on an area basis, and to look to see whether we are effectively addressing disadvantages accurately, as I would hope we would. Thank you.
No, thank you, Councillor Illingworth. At the minute, we're actually going through a big transformation within the council, as you know, not only service review, but we're also looking at transforming our core business systems. And I'm actually on that project, and so is Jonathan Foster. We're looking at bringing in more dashboards and looking at different ways to present all information, not just financial information, but any information that would be more useful to help better decision making. And it will be a longish project, medium term project. It won't happen overnight, but as a council, and obviously we're driving it from an internal audit perspective, it's about having the right information at the right time, and actually having really good quality information so that the decision makers can make the best decision possible for Leeds. So I agree, Councillor Illingworth. We do need to progress in that direction. We are progressing in that direction, but we're on the journey.
Thank you, Louise.
Thank you.
Can I bring in Councillor Garner next?
Thanks, Chair. Just on that point, Louise, are those dashboards intended to be publicly available, or for internally, but for members as well, or completely open to the public?
I think the starting point is internal. However, like I said, it is a work in progress. Obviously there needs to be some open data out there so that the total population can access it. Dashboards are just make it more accessible. You can have it with nice dials, you can have it on a map. Do you know what I mean? It helps drill down. So like I said, it's the aspiration is there to achieve that, but it is definitely a journey. But yes, I do see members having access to that going forward, but it's still very much in the development stages at the minute.
Fantastic, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Louise. I can't see anyone else indicating unless someone waves at me on the screen, which I can't see. So thank you very much. I'd just like to also thank you for adding in information that we discussed in Chair's brief. So those areas where we added information, members haven't asked questions. So I take that as that was good. So thank you very much. So let's move on to agenda item number 9. Approval of the annual governance statement. As you know, you've all seen this previously, but I'll hand over to Kate if she wants to add any comments.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, members did receive the interim AGS back in July when it had been published to the Council's website alongside the draft accounts. The report that you've got today confirms that there were no comments received as a result of that publication, and that the statement has now been amended to ensure that it presents an up-to-date picture. The amendments that have been made are all detailed at paragraph 3.5 of your report, and I'm not going to go into them in detail. It's safe to say that largely they're either confirming that we've completed actions that we said we were going to do and the time has passed, or providing confirmation that the internal controls that we've got in place remain sound in the impact of COVID. This year, all new and approved at Appendix B to the report, there's an action plan setting out how officers actually intend to achieve the actions that are identified within the AGS, and it is intended to track that action plan. So we anticipate being able to come back to committee in December with a brief update to let you know whether everything is on track or not. And finally, to note that perhaps the one consistent piece of feedback that we did receive in drafting is that it's very, very long. And therefore, there is a plan to review the approach that we take to the AGS, to review best practice across core cities, across our fellow authorities in West Yorkshire, and any other really good examples that anybody else points us to try and come up with a much leaner, more focused AGS for the 2020-21 year. So that will be next year's joy for members. Other than that, I have nothing to add.
Thank you very much, Kate. Do members have questions? I'll start with Councillor Trustwell.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just going back on Kate's final point, I'm all in favour of crisper, more tightly written documents. However, I think we run the risk, if we're not careful, of going back to the other extreme of lots of general platitudinous and not particularly helpful statements. I think we still need to be very disciplined. I could ask a number of questions. I'm going to only ask 2. You'll be pleased to hear. On page 53, there's reference to climate change, and I just wondered whether, because I'm not involved in that element of the council's activity, we are developing a series of KPIs, not necessarily just a few for the best council plan, but a much more extensive list of KPIs to measure our progress, because obviously this is an issue that is of great interest, not just to members, but to our constituents across the city. And the second point, there is reference, almost a full page, on page 55, I think, to staff and staff welfare. And I'm just conscious that we are moving into a period where we've been forced to make even more extensive cuts than has been the case. We are shedding an incredible number of staff for one reason or another, mainly through ELI. And I'm just wondering whether we are reviewing our HR processes to provide undoubtedly the extra support that's going to be needed for staff, because in my experience, these levels of staff loss invariably lead to the remaining officers having to shoulder greater burdens and working under even greater pressure. And I think it's absolutely crucial that we've got the HR support, either directly or commissioned, to help staff over the rest of their working lives almost.
Thank you, Councillor Trustwell. Kate?
It's a product of the fact that I'm bringing together assurances from across the council that means I can't answer your questions ultimately here and now. In terms of climate change, you'll recall that there was some discussion in the September meeting as to the committee's approach to climate change. We did take that up in a discussion with Councillor Scopes, and I suspect it's something that we'll pick up again following this meeting, looking at how the committee can engage to ensure that we do have a robust system of internal control to make sure that the climate change aspirations of the authority are actively pursued. So certainly watch this space, and we will come back on that. And in terms of staff and staff welfare, on behalf of all staff, thank you very much for your concern for those of us who do remain. It is a big change. We are certainly seeing, for example, the approach to the appraisal this year has been changed to accommodate that staff welfare approach. It may be that that's a question, however, that is better picked up next time in December when we have the business continuity report coming to councillors.
Yeah, and thanks for that, Kate. So on that one, I think it'd be really helpful if you flag that's going to come as a question in terms of business continuity, both in terms of the practical, can we keep it together, as well as the, are we keeping our staff happy? Because I think both of those are key questions around continuity. On the climate emergency stuff, you're right, we did discuss it before, and we just to bring Councillor Trustwell and other members up to where I'd got in my thinking in terms of how we do it. I think we needed, I felt like I and we as a committee probably need to engage with Polly Cook, who's one of the key climate emergency people, in terms of how we're going to benchmark in terms of steps to get to 2030, because it's all well and good saying we'll be carbon neutral by a date in the future, but unless we have some tangible steps, we as a corporate governance and audit people, it's very hard to monitor progress without knowing what progress we wanted. So I think there's a conversation to be had and a plan to be made by Polly and that team, which is what's the plan. And I hope they've made progress, otherwise that's a problem. But we do need to bring them to the committee in the fullness of time. Absolutely agree with that statement. Good, thank you. Is that okay, Councillor Trustwell?
That's fine, Chair, thank you.
Yeah, good, thank you. Okay, Councillor Garner.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you, Kate, for the report. Just on your last point, Chair, yes, some benchmarking against the other, because every other authority in the country near enough has declared a climate emergency and probably has similar 2030 aspirations. So some benchmarking would be great. But that's a good plan, Chair. On Councillor Trustwell's point and the HR bit, I know that from working in the NHS, the NHS People Plan that was published earlier in the year post-COVID is fantastic piece of HR work, which I'm sure we can work with our NHS colleagues in Leeds to sort of mirror that for the local authority, especially as we have lots of shared posts. So that might be a route to go down. And Paul, I'd recommend giving that a good read if you're interested. And then just on the point on page 52 on the COVID-19 arrangements was going to be my main question. I'm sure everyone heard at full council there was some concern, and Councillor Blake quite rightly said discussing it in the right place at the right time, which is this committee. But will this be sort of something on pretty much all the meetings going forward? Just looking at the work plan, there's nothing in there yet up until March 2020, but is the plan for after March, or to jimmy in some items before March on our COVID-19 arrangements?
Chair, if it assists, certainly the approach that we've taken in discussing all of the annual assurance reports that come through to committee with officers in the preparation, is that each and every one of those should address the COVID impacts on that particular internal control. So rather than having one report on this is COVID, it's a systematic approach to everything the committee considers as the year progresses, and that will feed in then to the annual governance statement that we ask you to approve next year, which will look at this whole COVID period.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think we've definitely talked about the approval process for decision making in committee, and that's been partly because of COVID. The other comment I'd make is the point about the 2030 timeline. It's actually quite, councils across the country have actually got quite inconsistent targets, and some have a date of 2030, some don't have a date of 2030, some have sort of mentioned it in debates but not actually put it into writing. And so I think the benchmarking with other authorities is going to be really difficult, because I think we've been quite ambitious and written stuff down and said 2030, and there's a few councils that have done that. But for example, my understanding, like Bradford, they have this sort of vague 2030 thing, but they haven't written it down in the same way. That's my understanding, so apologies if, but I think there's definitely a huge range of that. Good. Okay, I'm going to bring in Councillor Bentley next, if that's okay.
Thank you, Chair. I'm afraid I was offline for a few minutes, so I'm not too sure whether this has been covered or not. But on page 57, the piece about the voice of the customer, and this is something that we've had in front of us at numerous committee meetings over the years, and I'm always challenging on this, and I'm always disappointed by responses. We talk about the voice of the customer. We talk about the customer is at the heart of the service delivery, and the voice of the customer, whether it be face to face in a hub, on the phone to the contact center, online via the website, it is the one interface that our residents have with the council, and that experience should be more than good. It should be exemplary, and it never is. And we know as elected members how many issues we have in casework where it starts with that poor contact or that poor response to the contact. And in the 8 years I've been a councillor, it's never been right, and it's never got right, and it's never seemed to be a proper roadmap to getting it right. And I know it's difficult. Customer service is difficult. And I think we all understand that background. So what I'm really coming to is the key action on this is so weak. It's so bland. We will continue to monitor arrangements. There's no targets in there. There's no what good looks like. And I think this is something either we or the relevant scrutiny board, if we want to push it to a scrutiny board, has really got to get on top of. It is the big weakness in the council that produces so many other issues, knock-on issues further down, because that initial contact, that initial ownership isn't right. It is a hobby horse of mine, Chair, so I will stop now.
No, I welcome it as a hobby horse, Councillor Bentley. I'm just looking at the key action, and I don't know what anyone would think about how whether we could look at just tweaking it. If I work with Kate outside this, just to tweak it to make it a bit more robust, I think that might be helpful if committee agrees. And let me just bring in Councillor Graham, because I think she wants to comment on this point.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I think Councillor Bentley, you're correct in some points, but let's face it, every large company that has where the contact, you phone through, contact centre, myself, I was chair of scrutiny, when the contact centre first started off excellently, but at the end of the day, and no disrespect to anybody who's behind the phone, it depends on who you get, doesn't it? You must have had similar experiences in your own life when you've been booking something or chasing something. So I think we just need to be careful how we address that. And it's not just a problem that the council will have. And on that, Chair, I'd like to say that I've agreed with everything that Councillor Trustwell has said earlier as well. So I'm not being quiet, it's already been said. Okay, Chair, thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Graham. I'm all for not saying the same thing repetitively, which I think sometimes we do as councillors. So thank you for that.
Can I just
Councillor
come back
Bentley,
on?
yeah, definitely come back, Councillor Bentley.
Yeah, I agree entirely with Councillor Graham that all companies have these problems. That doesn't mean they should be accepted. I worked in customer service and you can boo at me. I worked for O2 in customer service, and I'm not holding that up as an example, but it's an example of the difficulties. But it's not just about the person on the phone. I mean, they can have a bad day or whatever, but it's the training, it's the process, it's the approach, it's the underlying system. It's about ownership. So yes, you can have a bad day. Things can go wrong. I understand that, and no one's complaining about that. No one's saying that the staff don't work hard, not committed. But it's an underlying process, training, and management expertise in understanding what this is about.
So just thinking about how we take this forward, Councillor Bentley. I think the customer service report is coming in February, and so if we, as an action from this meeting, ask Kate to write to the author and say, look, we are concerned about a lack of action plan for continuous improvement in this area. Maybe concern is not the right word, but we'd like to see an action plan and a target and what good looks like and where we want to get to as part of that report. Would that be a way forward from this, Councillor Bentley?
That would be fine. It's just identifying the issue, Chair. Thank you
yeah.
very much.
So let's do that and flag it for February's meeting. I think that would be good. Councillor Illingworth, I know you've been waiting for a little while now. Thank you. No, not yet.
Success. So, apologies, Chair. I just lost the cursor and I was scratching around on the screen looking for where it had gone to hide. Anyway, yes, I wanted to add a little bit more on climate change, if you don't mind, Chair. And my concern that we're not being sufficiently rigorous on carbon dioxide reduction. At the moment, we're looking on a good curve and we're heading in the right direction, but it's very much dependent on the switch over to natural gas, and we need to cut that natural gas. And also, there's quite a chunk of stuff in the MRF, the incineration facility, which is basically burning carbon-rich plastics, and it's a big block of stuff that isn't going to easily shift. So I'm concerned about whether we're getting CO2 emissions down fast enough, and specifically about that large block of carbon with the MRF and the need to make serious inroads into our natural gas usage. It's not, the next half isn't going to be anywhere near as easy as the first half, Chair.
Okay, thank you for that, Councillor Trustwell. I don't think it's fair to ask Kate to respond to that because of a technical area, but I do think there's a point around writing that down and making sure when we get a report from Polly or someone in that department that they address that issue. Is it on this point, Councillor Hammond?
It's about the previous point on satisfaction.
Yeah, sorry. Yes,
can the February report include how we measure customer satisfaction? And if we do it, can we see the figures? If we don't do it, can we propose how we might do it?
Yeah, thank you. I can see Kate making notes, so that's good. Thank you. John, is that okay if we make a note from your point? Because I don't think we can respond to that. Yeah, great. He's nodding just for those who can't see him. Good. Okay, Councillor Trustwell, you're next.
Chair, it was just going back to the point about how we monitor satisfaction. I mean, Could the key action be a little bit tighter in terms of saying that we'll continue to set and monitor robust targets, and then the rest of the rubric? I'm conscious that a couple of years ago, the council made some savings, i.e. cut staff in the contact centre, and that immediately and predictably led to a diminution in the satisfaction feedback that we were receiving, and a lot of that staffing was reintroduced. So I know that we do look at this consistently, but I think we need to perhaps be a little bit more stringent in our language about our intention as an authority to set and monitor, you know, robust targets relating to satisfaction. I just think it would tighten up that key action.
So you're suggesting a changing in the wording, and such it would say, we will continue to monitor arrangements for customer satisfaction, contact and satisfaction. We will make.
No, I think we will continue to set and monitor robust targets for customer contact and satisfaction, and then the rest, and we'll make improvement where necessary, etc., etc., etc.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Are we happy to support that as a committee? Just make that change. I can see nods, and no one looks like they're disagreeing. Yep, great. Okay, so we'll make that tweak, Kate. I hope that's okay. Yep, that's a smile. I take that as a yes.
My only comment, Chair, would be that, of course, in drafting the AGS, we did push the key actions past officers. I have to say, it's not the case that it was ever anything more stringent and got watered down. This was just the first wording that went to officers, and I don't anticipate there being a problem with it. But I ought to give them the courtesy of at least seeing it before we amend it in the AGS.
Yeah, and particularly the other signatures on the page 4 of the report, 50 of the pack. Clearly you need to flag to them. But I can't imagine any of them having a objection to that point. So I think we should just crack on with that. I can't see anyone else indicating. So can we accept subject to that change, accept the recommendation on page 44, 5.1? And is that okay? I take silence as yes. Good. And then I realised we didn't formally approve the recommendations on the previous report, which was Louise's report. And so can we accept the recommendations on page 39, 6.1 and 6.2? Take silence as agreement. Good. Okay, thank you very much, members. So on to item 10. It's page 127 in your packs. It's quite a long way through. That's why I'm giving a page number, because obviously the AGS is a large document. And onto the account. So I don't know who wants to speak first. It looks like Mary's looking keen.
Thank you, Chair. Yes. So the report updates members on progress towards a final audited set of accounts. It presents Grant Thornton's draft ISA 260 report and also the audit report on their IT audit work, which was carried out earlier in the year. A revised set of draft accounts was sent out with the committee papers. As indicated in their draft report, Grant Thornton's audit work is ongoing in terms of both the accounts and the value for money conclusions. There is one substantive issue in terms of the accounts on which they are still to reach a conclusion, and that is in relation to the accounting treatment of Merrion House. So I'll just say a little bit more about that. As the committee may recall, the council leases in the Merrion House office block from a limited liability partnership in which the council itself is a 50% shareholder. During the 2018-19 year, we renegotiated the terms of the lease so that instead of paying annual lease rentals, we paid an upfront lease premium to cover the remainder of the life of that lease. That was £54 million, and that lease premium was immediately redistributed to ourselves and the other shareholder, excuse me, on a 50-50 basis. So the point at issue is the accounting treatment for that capital distribution. It's not the accounting treatment for the lease itself, which is unchanged. So the question is whether that capital distribution should be recognised fully as income immediately, or whether it should be treated as deferred income held on the balance sheet and recognised gradually during the life of the lease. What we did in the 2018-19 accounts was to treat that as deferred income held on the balance sheet. That was a position that we discussed with Grant Thornton prior to the 2018-19 accounts. However, since then, the first set of accounts for the limited liability partnership itself have become available because it has a year end of 30th of June, and because as a limited liability partnership it has a full 12 months to file its audited accounts. Those accounts weren't available until June of this year. Those accounts do show that the value of that capital distribution has reduced the net worth of the limited liability partnership, by that full £54 million. So in the light of that, what we are now intending to do is reduce the value of our shareholding in the partnership and accordingly recognise the full capital distribution as income and place that in an earmarked reserve to be used again over the life of the lease. The revised draft accounts, which were circulated with the committee papers, show that as a 2019-20 income recognition on the basis that that was when the information became available to us. However, Grant Thornton are currently considering whether or not to ask us to treat it as a prior period adjustment to the 2018-19 accounts. So the end result in terms of the balance sheet as at 31st of March this year would be unchanged, but there would be material changes to the income and expenditure account in both years and to the balance sheet for 31st of March 2019 if that were to be the case. In terms of other changes that we've made since the draft accounts were presented to the committee, we were advised over the summer that the actuaries to the West Yorkshire Pension Fund had identified an error in their calculation of the assets for the pension fund as a whole, and the council's share of that was to increase our pension fund assets by £21.6 million. There has also been another tribunal pension case over the summer, which has universal impact, and we have therefore recognised a further 9.7 million of pension liabilities as the estimated cost of that case. That's the case known as the Goodwin case. So the net impact of those two changes is that our net pensions liability is now reduced by £11.9 million. Turning to the collection fund, we have been able to reduce the provision for appeals in terms of business rates. The primary reason for that was better information in terms of potential appeals on doctor surgeries, and a more detailed note of that was circulated to the committee last week. There has also, however, been an increase in other appeals provisions, which has partially offset that. Basically, over the summer, we have seen a very significant increase in the number of business rates appeals being raised, and presumably this is as a result of the pandemic and the impact on businesses' financial position. As things stand, those appeals have been put into the provision on the basis of the same success rate as other appeals, as that is the only information we have at this point in time. But it may be as the valuation office get to dealing with those appeals that they are, you would expect, possibly at a lower success rate than others, but that remains to be seen. We have also increased the bad debt provision for business rates in the collection fund, as collection rates over the summer indicate that there is likely to be a reduced ability to collect the business rates owing from the old year. So we're now projecting collection rates of 98.2% for prior year business rates debt. The bad debt provisions for council tax and housing rents and other major areas of income have been reviewed, and At the moment, data indicates that there is no need to increase the bad debt provisions for any of those other areas. In terms of fixed assets, checking over the summer has identified errors in the valuations of 2 assets included in the draft accounts, and the net result of that is to increase the value of assets on the balance sheet by £4.2 million. It has also been identified that 1 further painting valued at £2 million should have been included in heritage assets on the balance sheet, so that has also been added to the revised draft accounts that were circulated. In terms of the general position of uncertainty around asset valuations, the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors declaration on material uncertainty is still in place. So there is very little change to the level of disclosure in terms of material uncertainty of asset values at the balance sheet. However, what we have done is added an additional disclosure in terms of the pension fund assets, as the pension fund does hold not insignificant property assets, so there is an additional disclosure explaining that those are also subject to material uncertainty as at 31st of March. In terms of recommendations made in Grant Thornton's draft ISA 260, there is one high-level recommendation in relation to the accounts. That was that the draft accounts, the related party disclosure in relation to senior officers was produced on the basis of the previous year's register, as due to the pandemic, the senior officers register of interests disclosure had senior officers register of interests exercise had been delayed. That exercise was completed over the summer, and therefore the disclosure in relation to senior officers in the revised draft accounts that you've received is based on the up-to-date senior officers register of interests. There were no additional transactions to be included, but one entity is no longer a related party, so the disclosure is actually reduced as a result of that being up to date. As indicated, Grant Thornton, at the moment their audit work is ongoing, and their intention is to produce a final ISA 260 report for presentation at the December committee. Given that and the unresolved situation as regards the Marion House, we are not in a position to ask members to approve the final accounts at today's meeting. That does mean if we are delaying the approval of the accounts to the December meeting, that we would need to take into account any events that happen up until the date of that meeting. So there is still a potential for further post-balance sheet events to happen, which may need further adjustments to the statement of accounts other than those that I've described. With that, I'll hand over to the Grant Thornton team to present their reports to you.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Chair. If I perhaps kick off and talk through some of the headline messages in the report, and then I'll let Perminda come in a moment. So if members could turn to page 141 of 202, which is headed up section 1 headlines. So this is our ISA 260 report. As Mary just said, it is a working draft of this report with a view to the final version coming to the next meeting of this committee on the 14th of December. It's our key report of the year that essentially summarises all the key findings in our audit work, both in the accounts and also the value for money conclusion. So in terms of some of the headline messages, the first one there is around the impact of COVID, and we've highlighted there, obviously that's led to an increased level of work and focus on key areas of estimate and judgment, such as the valuation of PPE or fixed assets and pensions. But I think ultimately it's really added quite a bit of time to the audit in terms of completion of the audit. And I think, it's inevitably had that impact, given that, both our team and the council team both been working remotely. That's been a key challenge this year, undoubtedly. I think there are other factors at play. There's been some issues around some of the functionality of the ledger that the council uses, and we know that the council's sort of looking at that in the future. And clearly there's been a lot of discussions on both sides around the financial position of the authority as things have sort of moved on and during the summer and the early autumn. So in essence, we will be providing we can conclude not just on Marine House, but there are other issues that we're still working through and finalising with finance colleagues at the moment. Providing all those are finalised and resolved satisfactorily, we would hope to sign off following the next audit committee on the 14th of December. What the council will need to do, given that that would be after the 30th of November, in order to comply with the statutory requirement, is just to highlight in a short paragraph on your website that the audit remains ongoing. There's still one or two issues being worked through with the auditors, and that hopefully, we will be signing off on that week of the 14th of December. There are no financial penalties for the authority arising from the audit going on after the 30th of November. There's no naming and shaming or anything like that. And I guess just to say that the current projections of GT are that probably 20 to 25% of audits may be missing the 30th of November date, and they're typically the larger sort of more complex, higher risk authorities, the big urban metropolitan councils, those type of authorities. So you certainly won't be on your own in that, and hopefully any extension is quite brief, and that we conclude that prior to Christmas. The next section is financial statements at the bottom half of page 141. So some of this Mary's already touched on in terms of some of the changes that have arisen following the audit. So we've got the Goodwin judgment there of just less than £10 million. We've then got a couple of balance sheet amendments in terms of classification of investments to cash equivalents based on the liquidity of those investments, being able to change those into liquid assets fairly quickly. And then there's a change between creditors and grant receipts in advance, which we're still working through. Marine House, as Mary said, discussing the revised treatment of that in terms of the distribution in year to treat as income and then go into reserves. And then the secondary question then arising from whether that's delivered in 1920 or whether it should be treated as a prior year adjustment. As Mary said, ultimately the end point is the same. It's just how it's treated in terms of an opening position. Other than the Marine House point, though, none of the other adjustments to date impact on the usable reserves of the council. So that's quite a key point to make to members. There's a more detailed breakdown of other sort of presentational amendments in Appendix C. We've also got a list of recommendations at Appendix A in the action plan, both in terms of the accounts and the value for money conclusion. And we've also followed up recommendations that we raised in the prior year. So moving across to page 142, I guess that sets out in a little bit more detail in terms of some of the areas of work alongside Marine House that we're still working through with finance colleagues, including the going concern assessment. So on receipt of that, we'll be reviewing that in detail in time for the next committee on the 14th. And this year there's been what's known as a hot review. So our central technical team, on a cyclical basis, they review some of our larger, higher profile audits, and Leeds have been subject to that this year. And as part of the Grant Thornton procedures, that hot review needs to be formally signed off and agreed by our technical colleagues before we can conclude the audit. The assurance from the pension fund auditor of West Yorkshire Pension Fund, we've received that letter at the back end of last week. We're still just double checking the actual opinion, which we're expecting this week, just to make sure that we appropriately reflect that in our opinion, and indeed the council's accounts appropriately reflect what the pension fund auditor has said. Then moving on to value for money arrangements. So members of the committee will recall that we had two significant VFM areas of focus this year. One was in relation to the council's arrangements to plan and prepare for Brexit, which we've concluded that review, and we were satisfied with the arrangements in place. And then the second area was looking at the council's financial sustainability. And obviously we raised some points last year around the council's level of reserves, and we were aware that the council was on a journey to build up those reserves and had a plan in place to do that. And then obviously COVID pandemic hit in the middle to late March, and in common with a number of other authorities, that had a real impact on the council's financial position. We've been in regular discussions with the Section 151 officer throughout that period from the end of March up until now around tracking the impact of COVID on the Leeds financial position, looking at the actions that the council's been taking, the decisions that have been through SMT and through member approval. And ultimately, we have reached a view where, from a value for money conclusion point of view, in terms of our opinion, we're proposing what's known as an except for value for money conclusion. So essentially saying that the council's got appropriate arrangements in place to secure its use resources and value for money, except for the level of reserves in place to deal with a significant impact such as the COVID pandemic. As we've said on page 143, just over the page, if COVID hadn't hit, the council's position would have continued to be sufficiently stable. You've, as an authority, you've been able to deal with small unforeseen events in previous years. However, the COVID impact has been so significant that it did call into question the level of those reserves. What I can tell the committee this morning is that Parminder and I went to our National Consistency Panel last Friday, and the panel accepted and agreed the except for qualification. So that's now been through a formal national review by our national panel. One of the key points I think I'd just make on value for money is that we've agreed with Victoria and Richard that we will continue to have as a minimum monthly meetings from now through into the spring to look at both the outturn position in terms of 2021 and also the setting of the 21-22 budget. And if we identify any sort of significant concerns or issues in either of those 2 points and any potential deterioration in the council's finances, then that might lead to us triggering a more significant use of our external auditor powers. So we'll be monitoring that very closely with the Section 151 officer and her senior team. In terms of statutory duties, just to confirm that we received no objections or questions from local electors in terms of the accounts, and that once we've concluded the audit, we will need to do our audit of the whole of government accounts. And that means that our audit certificate concluding the 1920 audit will be issued once we've completed the WGA review. So I think those are some of the key messages, Chair. As it stands at the moment, subject to satisfactorily completing our outstanding work, there's going to be a clean, unqualified audit opinion on the accounts with that material uncertainty around valuation of fixed assets or PPE and the valuation of pension fund investments. And there will be a qualified except for value for money conclusion, which is saying that the council's got appropriate arrangements in place except for the level of reserves to deal with the significant impact of the pandemic. So those were the sort of key messages from my perspective. I'll hand over to Parminder, who might just want to talk through one or two other key points in the rest of the document, Chair. Thank you.
Thanks, Gareth. Just turning over onto the next page, page 6 of our report. I think the key points just to draw out here are there are a number of outstanding items that we're still working on, which are on the right hand side of the page, which Gareth has already referred to. And also at the bottom of the page, just to set out the materiality that's been set for the audit at Leeds City Council. Over the page then, we're into the significant risks that we've identified. Obviously, COVID-19 is a significant risk which has impacted on our work and, of course, the operations of the authority. And we've obviously worked with management throughout the last 7-8 months, looking at the actions that you've been taken. But also, I think it's worth drawing out that we've liaised with other audit supplies, regulators and government departments to ensure there's a coordinated approach across any of the work that we undertake. The additional work also relates around COVID-19 to the adequacy of the disclosures in the financial statements, and given the changes that can and have resulted from COVID-19. And as Mary referred to earlier, the material uncertainty around valuations is just one example. And the other areas that we've looked at are around some of the management assumptions that underpin the financial forecasts and whether they needed to be revised and updated. Those discussions have remained ongoing and been quite useful, and that work obviously will continue until we conclude our audit. Over the page onto page 8, this is where we now set out what are the 2 significant audit risks that all auditors are required to consider. The first one's around the revenue cycle includes fraudulent transactions, and at the planning stage of our work, we rebutted this risk on the basis that the opportunities to manipulate revenue are pretty limited, and also the culture and ethical framework within the authority means that all forms of fraud are seen as unacceptable. And we felt that our standard audit procedures around that meant that we didn't need to undertake any enhanced work. So we reviewed that assessment as part of our final accounts work and concluded that it was still a risk that we could rebut. The other area that all auditors are required to consider is a management override of controls, and around that, the areas that we focus on are looking at the controls over journals, the journals that are being processed during the year, and particularly at the year end, which we also then undertake testing on, and also looking at things like accounting estimates and critical judgments that are being applied and made by management, and Merrion House is perhaps an example of one of those which we're continuing to look at the moment. The main other focused areas of work then commence on page 9 of our report, 9, 10 and 11. So the significant areas that we focused on were the valuation of land and buildings. Obviously, it's one of the biggest items of value in your balance sheet, and therefore that was one area that we looked at. Whilst our work remains ongoing, no issues have come up to date, except for this highlighting, as I think has been referred to already, the material valuation uncertainty resulting from COVID-19, and that relates to council house investment property valuations. And I think it's just useful to highlight that that's a national issue and it applies to most local authorities, so you're not in any way unusual with having that included. The other area is around the pension fund net liability. Again, this is another very, very significant balance in your accounts. And we've already referred to the couple of amendments that have been made relating to the Council's Actuary, Aon Hewitt, identifying an error. Goodwin and McLeod are 2 adjustments that needed to be incorporated. McLeod from last year is already built into the pension figures, and the impact of Goodwin is something that the authority is now processing in the draft accounts. We're still concluding our work from the West Yorkshire Pension Fund, and we'll need to have their signed accounts, obviously, before we can wrap up our work in that regard. Over the page then, we're then on to looking at some of the key estimates and judgments. Provisions for NNDR appeals, no issues arising from our work there, has been rated green. You will note that on land and buildings for council housing on page 11 and other land and buildings on page 12, both of those have been rated amber, and the main reason that we've rated those as amber is that the valuation basis was undertaken at the 30th of September rather than at the year end of 31st of March. And that meant that a lot of work had to be undertaken by both management to satisfy themselves that the valuation that you had at the 30th of September remained appropriate and accurate as at the end of the year at 31st of March. And we've raised a recommendation that we believe that you should obtain your valuation at the 31st of March each year going forward. Page 13 of our report, just to pick up on a couple of issues we've identified in terms of heritage assets. There was quite a big increase of 17.85 million. So when we started to look into this, we identified that a number of assets had been erroneously excluded and those had been added in. And that was around the council's approach, which you have a policy that any heritage assets over £1 million are valued, but those below £1 million are not. So this relies very, very heavily on that information being passed over to the finance team. And we've added a recommendation that your procedures should be strengthened to avoid any future issues of this nature. Over the page onto page 14, again, net pension liability. I've already identified, I think, the issues around that, so nothing further to add. The next page, on page 15, is on going concern. One of the areas that we as auditors are required to consider is management assessment of going concern. Given the impact of COVID-19, that is a significant area that will need to be considered as part of our work. And given the issues arising from the financial standing of the authority this year, that's not yet been prepared. So we're just waiting for that to come through. And I think that's linked also to the value for money work that we are undertaking, and the fact that the authority has withdrawn its application for the capitalisation order. Once that comes through, that will be something that we will consider. And that, just for your information, involves us looking 12 months ahead from the date of signature. So basically to November, December next year, looking at whether you have sufficient cash flow and finances to continue operations. Page 17, if we can move on to that, that's some other matters that particularly just want to draw out a couple of items. One was around related parties, which Mary has mentioned has been updated, and we will consider the update to the accounts to reflect the actual position for 1920. Bottom half of the page, there were a number of disclosure omissions to the financial statements that we identified, which are set out there. We're currently still discussing a number of these with the finance team to see which are likely to be processed, and we will update our report for the December meeting in that regard. There are some other issues that we've set out at Appendix B2. Over the page on to other matters, I think it's just important to draw out top of the page there that it's been a challenging audit given COVID-19 for both the council's finance team and ourselves. In terms of working papers, we initially had some problems around this in terms of getting those working papers as a platform to provide information to us wasn't available until a little later. And I think the other point to make here is that when we did receive working papers, these came through on an ongoing basis. And in certain instances, we couldn't easily reconcile the number in the working papers back to the Council General Ledger system, which meant that we had to then go back and ask additional questions or try and undertake that reconciliation by ourselves. I think that was partly also down to the fact that the council's FMN system is quite aged, it's quite old, over 30 years old, and we do understand that you are looking into a new system, which meant that our ability to actually reconcile the FMS system back to the I&E account and balance sheet actually took a lot longer, given its functionality was quite limited. So all in all, that added a lot more time to undertake the work and complete the audit, which, as you know, is ongoing. Marion House, I think Mary's very usefully explained that quite well. We're currently looking at that, and we will come to a review and report that in our updated report to the December Audit Committee. Over the page onto page 19, again, the annual governance statement we had a look at and we fed back. Obviously, the length has been reported on already, and also a suggestion that you might be able to enhance the reporting of the actions, which again has been taken on board, and we'll review the updated AGS in the coming couple of weeks. Just a note at the bottom of the page, one of the procedures we are required to undertake is to complete our work on the whole of government accounts consolidation pack. That work hasn't commenced yet because it's normally completed after all the accounts audit work has been undertaken, which then means that the closure of the accounts, we won't be able to certify that until that has been completed fully. The value for money section, I think we've sort of touched on. It might be useful perhaps just to, if you can perhaps just turn to page 24 of our pack. I think the key thing here is that when COVID hit, the impact was principally on 2021 and 21-22. The council at that time, sort of March, April time, felt that it could manage the position for 21-22, but its ability to manage the position for 2021 was limited. You did undertake a range of measures, expenditure controls, stopping recruitment, cutting costs wherever you could to try and bring that budget gap down. And by November this month, I brought that down to 30.5 million. So back in April, May, when you felt it was quite a challenge, you had applied for a capitalisation order. By early November, you decided that actually the gap was now sufficient, that we could actually manage that position ourselves, and then withdrew the capitalisation order. So based on that, what we felt was that you didn't have sufficient general reserves, and your arrangements were not sufficiently robust to manage the position, and hence the except for value for money conclusion that we are proposing. I think the other slide I'd just like to draw your attention to is on page 26 of our pack. What we've done here on page 25 and 26 is just compare Leeds with the other core cities, and the bottom graph on page 26 highlights that Leeds has one of the lowest general fund and non-schools earmarked general fund reserves of all of the core cities. Moving on to page 27 and 28, we looked at the council's arrangements for Brexit, and we believe these to be appropriate and satisfactory. So no issues to report on those. Just turning over then onto page 30 of our pack, just to highlight that we have no independence and ethics issues that we wish to highlight. We do provide the CFO insights on page 30, and have been doing that for a couple of years. Obviously, any decisions regarding that and interpretation are for management alone, and we provide nothing in that regard. The action plan is set out on pages 31 and 32 of our report. We have agreed management responses with management, and we will follow those up in due course. And I think the key ones to, I suppose, highlight from my perspective are on page 32. In terms of the future level of usable reserves, the financial position, and the number of actions that the council needs to continue to monitor its 2021 position and planning for 21-22. As Gareth highlighted, we will be meeting with Victoria and Richard on a regular basis going forward, just to monitor that and to ensure that what you plan to undertake is what actually is then delivered with a balanced budget position for 2021 and 21-22. The next page that sets out your implementation of actions from the prior year. One was around the valuation as at the 31st of March. It's moved to the 30th of September. So again, that's been re-raised. And the future level of usable reserves, we know Victoria has been increasing these, and they have actually increased over the last year, taking on board our recommendation at that time. Page 34 and 35 set out the audit adjustments. The top half of page 34 are the actual adjustments to the draft accounts, which Mary's already referred to. And then the misclassification and disclosure changes are set out at the bottom of page 34 and then on to page 35. Again, there may well be other areas that arise. as we complete our work, and any additional areas will be reported to the Audit Committee on the 14th of December. Important to note on page 36 of our report that there are no unadjusted misstatements. So basically there are no adjustments we've identified that you have not processed at this moment, but again we will adjust and update that as necessary. I think the final page I want to really pick up on is on page 37 on fees. We've incurred a lot of additional work agreeing the accounts to the ledger. You have a large number of PFI schemes, 13 in all, which obviously increases the level of review that we need to go through, and 5 valuers. You know, most authorities would only probably have 2. And then there's additional work around looking at PPE balances and of course the Marion House accounting issue. All of those added to the inputs which have elongated the time taken to undertake the audit. And of course there will be an impact resulting from COVID, but we will report the breakdown of additional fees in each of those areas to the Audit Committee when we have those numbers available to us. I think that's all I wanted to say, but I'll pause there and happy to take questions.
Thank you. I'm sure there'll be questions. I think I'll start with Councillor Illingworth because he put his hand up first.
Yes, Chair. Thank you. I hadn't realised what a meaty item this is going to be. It really is a fascinating document, and yes. I got a question. If I understood the situation correctly, it relates to COVID-19 and the cash flow position next year, Marion House valuations. As I understand it, and tell me if I'm wrong about this, that we've a large unexpected expenditure where we've incurred costs during the year, for example, on things like sports centres and Tropical World, with no income worth speaking of. So we've just money pouring out and nothing coming back in to compensate for that, and that will produce an effect on next year's budget, which potentially catastrophic and needs obviously an urgent response. I was therefore fascinated about the sort of time shift of the Marion House readjustment, because it potentially brings the income forward, which is exactly what we need. I'm not sure if it's enough to make a significant difference, but I can see that adjusting the date on which the thing is becomes available to the authority is something which could be extremely useful. And at the same time, I also wanted to query the procedure of evaluations. I have assets in my ward which I'm rather keen that we don't sell, but which are presently on the sales list on the basis of what I see as an unrealistic valuation. Now, what's the procedure for me to, in a constructive way, challenge that and say, look, I think you've got the value wrong. It's not going to work, isn't this? Can we look at other ways of beating the deficit? So that's the question I want to ask. Is Median a significant contributor towards the cash flow position next year? And how do we look at valuations realistically? Thank you.
John, on the Councillor Illingworth, sorry, on the question about what assets are sold, that's an executive board decision process. So I think that's probably to write to the executive members, including the leader and the deputy leader for resources, because he'll be ultimately, the two of them will be making decisions about what's bought, sold and not. On the other question, I don't know if Mary or Gareth wants to respond. Also, yeah, sorry, committed scrutiny boards, also resources. I think it's probably Councillor Trustwells will look at that budget perspective as well.
Councillor Scopes, shall I just come in about
yes, please,
COVID-19 and the monitoring?
Yes, please.
So, Councillor with the financial position of the council regarding COVID was first highlighted in April, May time, and we reported to June Executive Board on that position for the current financial year 2021. We then produced a report to Executive Board again, but covering both this financial year and next year on what we were going to do to manage that position, and also around the action we were taking. With regard to the capitalisation directive request, we did go to central government and requested that early on in the summer, and that's around prudent and robust financial management for the council. And we've been reporting to the executive board every month on how we were progressing on that and what we needed to do to manage the situation both in this year and next. For this financial year, a decision was taken at executive board that we would remove the capitalisation request, so we'd take back our application, and that was made on the basis that we felt that we could manage the position for this year, and that we had a robust plan in place in how to manage for next year as well. The Miriam House, which Mary will come in and will be able to provide some more information on, is around the accounting treatment of that prepayment that we made 18 months ago, and Mary will come in and go through some of the accounting requirements for that. That means then that we will have increased reserves for that asset, and therefore a decision will then be made whether we utilise that in this year to manage the current financial position. But I don't know if Mary, do you want to come in and just explain the accounting around that? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Victoria. Yes, Councillor Illingworth, you're correct that the the effect of the change to the accounting treatment is that instead of having deferred income sitting on the balance sheet, which we would draw down on over the life of the lease, we will instead be putting that value of £25 million into earmark reserves, which does give us more flexibility. Although obviously, if we are going to borrow from that to deal with the immediate crisis from the pandemic, we will need to have a plan in place to replace that over the life of the lease.
Thank you, Mary. Can I bring in Councillor Bentley next, please?
Thanks, Chair. I think my list of questions has just increased, having heard all that. First of all, can I just thank Mary and Gareth and Perminda, because I thought that was an excellent canter through this report, and very comprehensive, but also understandable, which is good. I've got a few questions, and I'll just list them and then take them as you want. The Marion House one, the thing, when we paid that lease premium, £50 million, how did we source that? How did we fund that? Was that through borrowing, or well, I'll leave it at that, and we can come back to that one. Heritage assets. I was surprised to see the way that those increased, and the explanation was very useful. A couple of questions on this. Do we ever make disposals out of our heritage assets? So is that increase, well, it is net, obviously, but is it net of disposals, or do we just never make disposals? And I got the impression that the valuation was done sort of as and when museum staff got round to looking at it, rather than a program of revaluations and asset management, and I just wonder whether that has been corrected or not. On the capitalisation order, I didn't realise it had been. I missed that completely. The fact that it had been withdrawn. But can I just ask Gareth or Perminda perhaps, and Mary, Victoria, but I got the impression, and tell me if I'm wrong, that if we had kept the capitalisation order request there and it had come through, that would have given us a sufficient cushion going forward, that we may not have had this except provision, except qualification. Whereas now we've sort of added pressure to ourselves. So bit more explanation of why we did actually withdraw that capitalisation order. And then the main question I had really was on the value for money part of the audit or the audit report, and the highlight of risk and actions, etc. And I noticed in the not the audit report, but the report that accompanied it on page 130, section 3.1.6, it says to continue the ongoing process to identify further savings, which is fine. And then in the action plan itself on page 170, where it talks about reducing council expenditure, and it says the council is currently trying to balance its budget gap, etc. The council should consider whether it has explored all possible options to reduce expenditure in all service areas. And this is something I raised at scrutiny when we were looking at the budget, that I just wonder whether the auditors are satisfied with the process of looking at expenditure reduction. Because the way I see it is it's still very much the basis of, well, let's have a look at sort of our business as usual and see where we can slice a few percentages off line by line. And even when we talk about business review, because that's the other part of the process, it's the business as usual and service review. The service review strikes me as not being a service review as such. It's not sort of looking root and branch at, are we delivering service in the best way? But it's still looking at that sort of, well, what can we stop spending money on? What can we increase our income on? Which isn't really service review. It's just more of the same. And I just get the impression that our approach is very much still the salami slicing approach. Even though some of those slices of salami are pretty thick, it's still that way rather than sort of getting back to root and branch, zero-based budgeting approach, which would be a lot more fundamental. And sort of this would, COVID and all the crisis we've got at the moment would give us the real opportunity to do that. So that's my questions and comments, Chair. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Bentley. Who wants to come in? Gareth's got his hand up, so we'll start with Gareth.
Yeah, I think of the 4 points Councillor Bentley raised, I think certainly the third one around the capitalisation order I'll come back on initially. I'm sure Victoria and Mary may wish to see more, but I think Councillor Bentley's point was, had the capitalisation order still been live, would we have issued a clean VFM conclusion? The view's probably the exact opposite of that, Councillor Bentley, to be fair, because essentially if you needed that capitalisation order to help smooth things and balance the books going forward, that by definition would suggest that the council didn't have appropriate arrangements in place to deal with the full impact of COVID. So the actual withdrawal of that led to an improved value for money qualification, because potentially you would have been looking at an adverse VFM conclusion rather than an except for. So I think that's quite a key point to flag in this meeting in terms of the withdrawal of that capitalisation order. And I think just to comment briefly around the value for money audit that we do, and looking ahead to the remainder of 2021 and 21-22 and the service reviews, what we've said in the report is that, in that except for qualification, we are satisfied appropriate arrangements are in place, except for, the level of reserves and the impact that COVID has had. But as we've said in the report, and Parminder and I both mentioned, we've been very clear with Victoria and her senior team that we're keeping a regular dialogue around the 2021 outturn position, Councillor Bentley, and indeed the 21-22 budget setting and the Section 25 report that Victoria will need to issue early in the new year. And if you know, we've got any concerns around either of those things or a potential deterioration in the financial position, then we may then look at you know, a more significant level of response from an external audit perspective. But at the minute, you know, based on the work that management have done from the starting point of the gap when COVID hit to where things are at now, we've been satisfied with the response that's been taken, notwithstanding obviously the recommendations that we got in the report that we'll be closely monitoring, not just finance colleagues, because ultimately, you know, it's members that are, you know, responsible for running the authority, that those decisions continue to be taken between now and the year end. I'm sure finance colleagues may wish to pick up on a couple of points.
I'd like to come in just on this point about capitalisation as well. I agree with you, Councillor Bentley. I think GT have got an accounting process which is a bit baffling to the layperson, where you'd think actually if you're spreading your costs more, that would be a good thing, and clearly demonstrating that we're able to cope without it, but asking for it, in my view, would show a positive approach. But Grant Thorne have been very clear to to Victoria and to the council that that's not their view, and the long and the short of it is they're the auditor and are entitled to their opinion, even if we and I and you don't agree with them. But those conversations have been had at some length, both by, I understand, with Victoria, but also with me at Chair's brief, because again, I asked exactly the same question. It seems not to make sense to me. But on the other questions, I don't know if who wants to respond to those ones.
If I could respond on the Marion House and the heritage assets.
Yes,
Chair.
please.
So in terms of Marion House and that lease premium payment we made, so we were paying out 54 million and getting 27 million back immediately in cash terms. So the funding requirement was a 27 million in cash terms. All of those transactions are revenue transactions, so there's no issue in terms of capital funding. But basically what happens is that that would have, we paid those out of the strength of our existing balance sheet. So although it didn't increase our capital funding requirement, it would have increased our real world borrowing requirement. So at the time, the Treasury Management team looked very carefully to confirm that the reduction in costs we were getting in terms of the discount we were getting as a result of paying that lease premium up front outweighed the projected additional borrowing costs that would have been incurred over the life of that lease. In terms of the heritage assets, the issue appears to be in terms of getting global reporting out of the database catalogue for the museums and galleries, rather than the fact that valuations aren't being done. So it's the practice that the curators will value the major assets each year. The primary reason for that is to confirm that the level of our insurance cover for those assets is satisfactory. So each year they're undertaking valuations of the major assets. As I say, there appears to be difficulties in getting that database to then give a comprehensive report of everything it's got that's over £1 million. So that's something that we'll be looking at with the Museums and Galleries Service over the winter to try and improve that. Sorry, you also asked about disposals. I'm not aware that we have ever in recent years disposed of any heritage assets. I think that in some cases there may be restrictions over us doing that in terms of how we originally acquired them. So within that collection of high value assets, I'm aware that some of them the council bought, but others of them were given to us. So I would suspect that there would be restrictions over disposing of the ones we were given to or bequeathed, but ones that we bought, we could, if we wanted to, sell those.
Thank you, Mary. Have all your questions been answered, Councillor Bentley?
Yeah.
No, one more, I thought.
No, I think so. Unless Victoria wanted to comment on the cost reduction exercise, but I'm happy on those. And yes. I like you. I'm still baffled by the logic of the capitalisation order, but that's probably why I was never an auditor.
Yeah.
Shall I just come back on the cost reduction exercise?
Yes, please, Victoria.
That'd be okay. I think we need to recognise that this is, as we've said, an unprecedented event. The pandemic and the level of savings that we've had to take out of the council, 118 million for next year in 1 year. I don't think we've ever seen that before at that scale. And therefore, we mobilised quite quickly how we were going to identify savings to be achieved, because obviously we needed to have that in place very quickly. So through the summer, that was when the work was undertaken to start to look at those proposals, and they've been put forward to Executive Board in September, October and November, and finally in December. Obviously, the position regarding the financial position for the council will have a challenging year again in 22-23, but not at the same level that we've had for 2021-22. So therefore, we will need to have a robust savings process in place on how we take that additional expenditure out of the council, and that is something that we are looking at in the next few months about how we would do that, not just based on asking all services to make a percentage reduction, but to look at the services that the council delivers, how we would do that, etc. And that will happen through the spring and coming back to Executive Board in the summer of 21. So we will be looking at how we actually achieve that. Thank you, Councillor Scopes.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Councillor Trustwell next.
Chair, I think Councillor Taylor was before me.
Okay, Councillor Taylor. I've seen you. I was going to bring him next, but that's fine. Bring him now.
Thank you, Councillor Trustwell. Thank you, Chair. On the heritage asset point, I have previously asked on this issue, and I was told that we couldn't receive a breakdown of what could be disposed because the council doesn't actually hold a list to be given out, even to members, of the items themselves. And the reason was that I was given is that it would be a thieves' charter, and I don't know if myself or members of this committee were being accused of being Ocean's 11 or something like that, but I'm still very much of the view that we should be made aware, even if it's in a private meeting, of the level of assets, given the value of some of the heritage items that the council own. Moving on to that's just my comments based on what Mary and Councillor Bentley were just saying. I didn't plan to bring that up. But moving on to Merrion House, I think it kind of does feel like a bit of a windfall, 25.5 million coming forward. But I think the expression used last week was there's no such thing as a free lunch, and the council is going to be having to make payments, significant payments related to Merrion House going forward. And I think that we should be as transparent as possible about this, and it should be made in the report just what additional costs going forward may be. But I have to say, personally, I agree with other people who've been discussing this previously, that I think this is possibly preferable to capitalisation as we stand at the moment. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Victoria, do you want to come in on that at all?
I would just say that if we had received the capitalisation directive, we would have borrowed for that funding and had to repay that borrowing over the life of the medium-term financial strategy, and also interest on that borrowing. And therefore, if we do look to use reserves or borrow from reserves, we pay them back, but we wouldn't have the interest charge on top of that as well to have to fund. So it is using it will add to the medium-term financial strategy. However, it'd be less than if we did do the capitalisation directive. Okay, thank you, Councillor Scopes.
Thank you. And did anyone want to comment on the point about the heritage assets that Councillor Taylor made? There must be a list of over £1 million ones at least, mustn't there?
Yes, and we'll have a look into that, Councillor Scopes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Do you want to come back in, Councillor Taylor?
Thank you, Chair. I think for the reasons that were just said, it is why I think it's preferable the route that's gone down. If I could just finally ask if we think there are any other bits that we could look at that are earmarked for reserves. You know, is there anything else that we could look to borrow from in this way? Effectively meaning that the reserve can be released now as opposed to later on. I think it's what I'm trying to get at. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a fair question.
I'd say that there's been a fundamental review of the earmarked reserves. Earmarked reserves are set up for a specific purpose, and we've reviewed when that purpose is required for. And therefore, I don't think that there is anything further that we can use the reserves for without not being having the financial resilience that we'll require over the next couple of years of the medium-term financial strategy. In fact, over that strategy in the last 2 years, we are looking to build those reserves up to give us some more resilience and sustainability, so that obviously not if a pandemic, but if anything of a significant nature happened again, we would be in a position where we could manage that within the year. So that is what we're looking at over the strategy. Thank you, Councillor Scopes.
Thank you. Councillor Taylor, your hand's still up. Do you want to?
Yeah, sorry, just one more time, and beg pardon of Councillor Trustwell when I was waiting. Just to reiterate the transparency issue on the repayments that I made in the first point, I think that's incredibly important at this point. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Taylor. Councillor Trustwell.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I just wanted to raise my concerns about a statement that occurs in the report on various pages, but I think the first page on which it occurs is page 143, where it talks about the financial impact of COVID-19, and I'm quoting, has been significant and highlights the inadequacy of the Council's general reserves and balances to cushion the impact of major events, etc. And then goes on the next paragraph to say this situation indicates weaknesses in the level of the general fund reserve. Now, unless my aging and failing memory is deserting me, which is always possible, I raised this issue some time ago on behalf of the committee, and I don't recall that the concern about our reserve position was expressed in quite such strident terms, and I didn't get the impression that we should be losing sleep about it. Now, let me make it quite clear. My intention in raising this is not to adopt a Boris Johnson approach of asking our auditors to soften or dictate or dilute an adverse statement, but it is pretty stark. And to describe COVID as a major event, I think, is to downplay it. I think all of us would accept that COVID is and has been an unprecedented and protracted peacetime disaster of an enormity that we never, ever witnessed before in local government, and could only really have been anticipated by our officers and leadership gazing into a crystal ball and or diverting resources away from frontline services in the anticipation that we might have been struck down by this huge cataclysm. And I know this is possibly regarded as a political point, but I'm going to make it nevertheless. The government has clearly welshed, and I know that's not a kind of technical accounting or auditing term, on its urging of local authorities to do what it takes in order to address the challenges of COVID, on the basis that we could rightly have anticipated as a result some reimbursement of our expenditure and loss of income. And tongue-in-cheek, I would just add that our auditors put in their fee requirement for this year, with a small contingency now coming back to us for an enhancement of that, because understandably the extra work that's been generated by COVID. And it just seems slightly ironic juxtaposition, but I make those points because seriously, I do think that the council's sort of been found guilty with hindsight of not making preparations for this enormous and unprecedented disaster.
Thank you, Councillor Trustwell. I don't know if Gareth wants to respond to that.
Yes, thanks, Chair. Thanks, Councillor Trustwell. Yeah, I mean, we have on that page 143, highlighted that, if it hadn't been for COVID, things would have been sufficiently manageable in year. And we acknowledge, obviously, we did raise the point last year, and we know that Victoria and colleagues had taken action to build up reserves in 1920. I think in terms of the impact of COVID at Leeds, it has been significant, and that sort of terminology around weaknesses in the level of reserves is unfortunately sort of audit speak that we're bound to do in relation to the NAOs and code of audit in terms of how we go about describing the value for money conclusion. So I mean, I think that page 143 is a balanced page insofar as we do acknowledge that it is due to the impact of COVID, and I think whilst COVID has certainly had an impact on all local authorities, obviously Grant Thornton have got 40% of the local authority market. The impact at Leeds, notwithstanding the fact obviously they're a very significant and large authority, but proportionately the impact at Leeds and perhaps one or two other councils has been greater than what we've seen at others. So, and I think some of that does come back to the starting point of your reserves at the point you went into the pandemic, perhaps being more challenging than the majority of other local authorities that we look at across the country. So I suppose we stand by that particular page, but I do take the point around the language that we've used in that. But I'll stand by that page. And in terms of the fees, again, I accept that we had a smaller variation that we discussed in the early part of this year, pre-COVID. As Perminder's set out, there's a number of reasons behind the additional work. COVID is obviously one of the factors. Once we've concluded the audit, we'll be subject to a discussion with Victoria's Section 151 officer around that figure, and we'll put that in the annual audit letter that's due, I think, to come to this committee at the beginning of February. And obviously, any fee variation is ultimately subject to PSA's approval. So they've got ultimate sanction, I guess, on these variations. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Trustwell. I support your comments, and maybe we should put in a letter after this isn't an audit. Grant Thornton's not predicting COVID either, and not putting in a big enough reserve in terms of their fees. Just on the fees, the other point I would like to make is that I think when you bid for the work, I think you knew we had 12 or 13 PFI contracts. I can't imagine that you didn't, and so I would find it difficult to see additional fees in that area. Secondly, COVID costs, whilst there are genuine extra costs you've talked about around Merrion House and that sort of thing, and around the value for money, where I recognise that there is some extra work that you've done and that costs you time. But if it's generic COVID work, I just think that's Grant Thornton's business for making sure their business is fit for COVID security and fit for working from home. And the council needs to do the extra work for where it's had extra costs due to COVID, and Grant Thornton needs to accept that there's extra costs due to COVID, and that is definitely not for Leeds City Council taxpayers to bear the price of. That's for Grant Thornton's shareholders, in my opinion. And I want to make that clear, as I did in Chair's brief, that that's certainly how I'll be looking at it. And whilst it's not technically our decision as a committee around what fee is agreed, I think we should still make clear our opinions, because that is our role. And I can see nods, so I think that probably means it's not just my opinion, it's the committee's opinion. So I want you to hear that. I can see Councillor Garner wants to comment.
Yeah, I agree, Chair, and although we made it clear to Gareth and Grant Thornton, it sounds like you did in Chair's brief as well, so thank you on the committee's behalf. I think if the defence is, well, it's the PSAA's decision whether it's an extra fee or not, could we lobby or write to the PSAA and say this isn't really fair, guys?
Yes. So on that, let's see what Councillor Hammond. I'll let you come in.
On this subject, I'd second or third the point that you just made, Councillor Scopes, and Councillor Garner as well. I've been both sides of this table in my career. I would have found it difficult to justify turning up and saying it's a bit harder than we thought, we'd like a bit more money. I don't think that's the way to do it at all. While I'm on stage, can I just mention reserves, where we've been walking this tightrope of reserves now for years. I went to see Alan Gay about it 3 years ago, and he shook his head and touched it and said it'll be all right on the night. But I admire the auditor's restraint in not being more vocal about this. It is one of the 2 or 3 biggest problems facing the council financially, I would think, really. And if they were more robust and determined in saying that they weren't happy with this, I think I would encourage them to be so.
Thank you, Councillor Hammond. Councillor Graham.
Thank you, Chair. Just quickly, having been chair of this board a few years ago, I think you've taken the correct stand, and I support you in what you've done in your decision.
Thank you. Okay, so I think, Councillor Trustwell's hand is up. Do you want to comment again?
Chair, it was just very quickly following on from the points that previous 2 colleagues have made. On page 175, and I should have raised this when I was speaking previously, there is a reference to remote working and delays and inefficiencies, but I'd want to, not necessarily now, but to unpick what that actually means, because I don't know about the rest of my colleagues, but I've actually found working remotely more efficient in many respects rather than being less efficient. But as this is one of the reasons quoted, I think, for increasing the fees, I'd like a better insight into why that has been inefficient and why it's taken more time. Officer time, sorry, and auditor time, rather than just in the overall scheme.
Yeah. Thank you, Councillor Trustwell. I'm proposing we don't get into that debate right now, because they haven't actually put any proposal in extra cost. They're teeing us up, and so we're teeing them back up in terms of our expectations. They clearly are in a strong position because we need them to sign off our accounts, and we need to look at our options in terms of writing to the PSAA and such worth, and I'm sure we'll discuss this again at length when Grant Thornton are ready to bring their fees. Victoria, do you want to comment?
Yes, please. Just to clarify that the fee increase has to be agreed with myself, and then we submit that to the PSAA. So if we don't agree with anything, then that's included in our response to the PSAA.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
But ultimately, it's you've got a delegated authority to make that decision, and then to the PSAA to sign off. I think it's important the committee we understand that. So let's. I can't see any more hands up, so we'll go back to the recommendations on page 133 of the pack. Are we happy to accept those recommendations? Paragraph 6. I think we are. Good. Thank you very much for that. And thank you to both Victoria and Mary and their teams, and Grant Thornton. I clearly have done a lot of work in the background. We would very much welcome being able to sign this off at the earliest possibility, and that is the 14th of December. And we very much hope you can do it, all the work required to do that. Okay, so on to item 11, work programme. Kate.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but before, can I ask a couple of questions about the accounts?
Oh yes, sorry. Did you want to make more comments on them? Sorry.
Well, just two one-sentence questions.
Yep.
On page 67, there's a list of senior employee remuneration, and some senior employees ceased to pay pension contributions this year. Now, perhaps somebody could tell you in confidence, and I'd particularly need to know why that would be, please. Page 67, employees' pension contributions.
Yep.
And I mean, if that's between you, the auditors, and on page 111, the collection fund chair refers, and so does the next page, to the West Yorkshire Fire and Civil Defence Authority, which changed its name in 1999 to West Yorkshire Fire and Rescue Service. It's not been civil defence since Tony Blair was Prime Minister.
Thank you, Councillor Harrand. We'll amend the final accounts for that.
Yeah, pension contributions, there's any number of reasons. It might have been they've reached retirement age, drawing their pension. Or Mary's wants to say something.
Yes, or their lifetime limit, presumably.
Yes, I believe they have all reached their lifetime limit, but we can double check and confirm that.
Is there a sorry, just going back to this, Grant, did you have it's an IT report from Grant Thornton on this agenda item as well?
We did, Chair. So on all our large significant audits, we have a team of IT specialists that perform a review of IT arrangements. So our colleague Callum Clark is actually on the call now to perhaps draw out some of the key messages in his report and deal with any questions that you or other members may have.
Yeah.
Don't know if
that's page 183 of this pack, isn't it?
Yes, it is, Chair.
Okay, Callum, go ahead, please.
Sure. So as Gareth said, we do a review on all our significant clients. Here we looked at FMS, which has been mentioned a little bit before, Civica Academy, which links to benefits, and the SAP payroll system. We didn't pull out anything very significant. There were 6 findings, primarily, I think 4 of those linked to SAP. It was the first time we looked at it in detail, so that was within expectations. And then there were a couple of other points that were also, again, quite minor, one around FMS and one around just general IT policies. In general, because I know the common question here is how does this compare to what we see elsewhere? And it's very similar. It's these level points, they come up regularly, and they kind of represent a tidying up normally around things like user access. So we're not overly worried about the risks they create. And one of the, I guess, the key feedback that we flagged up is that there's a lot of proactivity in response. Before the audit was complete, 3 of them had been addressed. 2 were addressed, I think, during the meetings with our auditors. So that was really proactive and great to see. And yeah, we will revisit these next year to see how things are progressing, especially around SAP and FMS, given that's obviously an older solution that was developed internally.
And Gareth, how does this report impact on the accounts and our process overall?
So it's a key element of our work to inform our audit strategy and audit testing. And obviously, if Callum had identified, a number of significant deficiencies and expressed significant concerns around the various IT systems that the council uses to produce the annual accounts, then clearly, our level of risk and level of testing would have increased significantly. We'd have had to do, even more sort of sample testing than we've had to do anyway on a job the size of Leeds. So, it helps inform the audit team's sort of wider audit strategy, and it's a key piece of work that we do what we call our major audit. So any audit with an I&E activity over 500 million, we would get Callum and his team in to do a review to help inform that wider audit strategy.
Thank you. Do any committee members have questions for Callum on this report? Councillor Trustwell, you've got a tick by your name, which I think means yes.
No, Chair, it's me agreeing with the recommendations that you moved before we went back.
Yeah, great, perfect. Thank you. So thanks for that, Callum. It's actually quite a helpful report. So I almost missed it. It's a I did actually read it. Good. Okay. So I think we'll move on now to agenda item 11 and hand back to Kate if she's got anything she wants to say on this.
Just to note on agenda item 11 on the work programme.
Kate, you're really quiet. I don't know if your mic's up. Yep, thank you.
Got you. Sorry. Quick tour of the changes to the work programme. It's proposed that the devolution report now be taken by committee at the February meeting rather than in December, to enable some joined up working between ourselves and the other West Yorkshire authorities, and some further thinking by the combined authority in relation to their governance arrangements moving forwards. You'll note that there's an additional report being added in the information management and governance realm, so that there are now two separate reports, one updating you on access and the other updating you on readiness to apply for PSN certification at the end of the year. As a result of the delay in approving the accounts, in December, we're looking to receive the final ISA 260 report from Grant Thornton, with their annual audit letter then coming to the February meeting of committee alongside the audit plan. And I'm relieved to see Gareth nodding while I say that. Also, members will recall that Gareth had kindly offered to provide a briefing on the Redmond review and on the new approach to external audit. That will be one joined up briefing now at the start of the February meeting as well. So that's all the changes in relation to the work programme. The only other thing is for members to agree the approach they want to take in terms of which reports come to the working group. It's proposed, subject to any alternative suggestion, that the working group, which is due to take place on the 30th of November, receives the officer report on corporate performance management arrangements and the two information management governance reports, so that members can discuss those in the working group, with the notes coming forward with the agenda when that's dispatched, leaving business continuity to be discussed in full committee at the December meeting, alongside the final ISA 260. That's all I've got, Chair.
Thank you. And just on the December meeting, the idea of moving to look at the PSN certificate as a whole is that we've been quite focused on the access project, rightly so, but that's only one element of the whole PSN certification requirement bit. And I think whilst we've been really focused, it's probably quite helpful to try and take a step back and say what are other risks other than access, and make sure that there's attention given to all of those different items, not just the one we're looking at, which hopefully is going on, but that's why we want to report on it specifically, or why I wanted to report on it specifically. I hope that's okay with committee. Are there any other questions on the work programme? No, good. Great. So here's a recommendation. We're meant to accept, paragraph 5 on page 199, which I think Kate's gone through effectively. I'll take silence as agreeing those recommendations. Good. Well, thank you very much, everyone. It's been quite a focused committee. I'd like to thank you for your participation and your clearly having done your homework before the meeting. It feels like that's been quite helpful, and I look forward to seeing you at the next working group shortly. Thank you very much.